Yes, it's been quite a long time since I've published my last video in my Loopback 4 series, December 12th, 2018, and I've had lots and lots of people comment asking me, hey, are you going to continue this series? Please explain access control. I can't wait for the next video. And I've been a terrible YouTuber and have not done anything in a while. And my excuse is probably lame, but yeah, I've been trying to really understand Loopback. I really wanted to understand Loopback really well before I continued this series, and part of doing that was deciding to contribute to Loopback 4. And one particular feature that Loopback 4 has, I don't know, really been lacking, that I really feel like it needs, is the has many through relationship. Basically the has many relationship. And yeah, so I just wrote a bunch of code over the past month working on this, and submitted my largest pull request that I've ever submitted in my life to an open source project. And it's currently in the review process. There's still more things I need to do to it, but I figured instead of finishing this, I should probably spend some time and make another YouTube video on Loopback 4 because you guys are wanting it so bad, and I feel really guilty. So that's kind of my excuse. Yeah, I also printed off the entire Loopback 4 documentation and read through every single line of it. So that's what this huge stack of papers is from. I actually would kind of recommend it. It's been a great experience. Okay, so with those apologies out of the way, let me get into our Loopback 4 series. So we left off with basically going through setting up a brand new Loopback 4 project, and you can actually find the code for this at codejamninja/identity API, because that's what we're going to be building. We're going to be building an identity API in Loopback 4, because it's an identity API, in my opinion. Not only is it a common API people need to build, but it also is a great API to showcase all the features of Loopback 4. So today, what I think I'm going to show you is how to take the initial setup of the Loopback 4 files and kind of add some of your own personal touch to it. I don't like all of the specific linting and prettier rules, I guess, that Loopback 4 initializes the project with. There's some like tweaks that I like to make to it, and so I'm just going to make those tweaks. These are kind of opinionated tweaks, but you can make your own custom tweaks to it. And so this video kind of will show you how to do that, how to kind of put your own personal touch to your code with a Loopback 4 project. So Prettier is this great tool that auto formats your code according to a specific rules that you give it. And so, you know, for example, this code got automatically formatted to look like this. And Loopback 4 automatically sets up your project with Prettier. So, for example, if I was to just do this to the code, you know, make it look kind of ugly, and then save the file, bam, it just got Prettiered. So I highly recommend using Prettier. You might have to install a plugin to get Prettier to work with your editor. I'm using Emacs, Spacemacs, and I can probably make a separate video on how to set that text editor up with Prettier. But yeah, highly recommended. But I don't like the Prettier defaults that Loopback 4 gives, so I'm going to modify them with my own personal config that I like. So you can go into this Prettier RC file and just add your own Prettier config. And what I like is I like the single quote, and I like all the rest of the defaults of Prettier. Now you'll see here I just got rid of the JSON, so this is actually, whoops, your Prettier RC file can actually be formatted as a YAML file if you want. So that's what I just did. So I just formatted it as YAML because I like that better. You could, you know, use JSON if you want. JSON format would look something like that. But that's not what I want. Let me go back. Bam. Perfect. Okay, so now that I've got that done, if I make a change and resave the file, you'll see it's going to look a little bit different. So it actually put spaces in between these. There's a few little, you know, it's slightly different. This is how I prefer my code, and you can, you know, do whatever you want with your own. But what's really cool is you can actually, there's a script that they have called prettier :CLI. No, prettier :fix. So if you run that, and I'm using Yarn, you can use, you know, npm run prettier :fix, and it's going to go through all your files and apply the Prettier rules that you have on them. And if it shows white, that means it made changes. If it's gray, that means it didn't make any changes. So if I run it again, I'm going to use Yarn. I like Yarn over npm. You can use either one that you want to. But yeah, if I run it again, prettier :fix, it's pretty much all gray because it didn't apply any changes. I'm not sure why it applied changes again on the tests, but basically it's working. So now I actually, in my scripts, I don't run a script called prettier :fix. Usually what I like to do is format. Like I have the script in all my projects, you'll see the script I have called format, and that runs the prettier fix. Basically, I find it more universal because some code I use is not JavaScript, you know, Python or Go or whatever, and I'll have a format script. So that's kind of the reason for that. And so I'm just going to npm run prettier :fix. And I'm using npm inside of here because I'm not assuming that a person's going to be using Yarn. That's why I like to, in my scripts, put npm, even though you'll see me using Yarn all the time. Okay, now let me just get rid of that. I just sorted everything. There we go. Add a comma there. And get rid of that comma. Okay. So now I can just Yarn format, and it should do the same thing. And bam, good. Okay, and Loopback has a nice clean script here, so that's great. But I prefer to clean my projects differently than the way that they are cleaning them. I prefer to leverage my git ignore file for my clean script. And you can, I wrote a really cool blog post on that. Okay, so I found that blog post, 1,000 ways to npm clean. I think I named it in a very clickbaity way because it's not really 1,000 ways to do it. But anyways, this is basically the final result of the script. I just couldn't remember it. Right. Ah, perfect. Yeah, git clean, and so I'm just essentially these -e flags are adding this line to the git ignore file just for this command. So I'm just excluding the node modules folder from the clean command, so that when I clean it doesn't wipe my node modules. Okay, so I just prefer that over the way that Loopback is cleaning it. So if I run yarn clean, you can see it should have got rid of the dist folder. Although we don't have a dist folder because I haven't run the project yet. So if I yarn start the project, we should end up with a dist folder, which we have here. There we go. So now if I yarn clean, removing dist, just deleted that folder. Boom. It basically clears all the files that are in your node, that are in your git ignore file, excluding whatever you provide to exclude. Now, one other thing, whenever I yarn install, it adds a yarn lock file. And you will find in most places they highly recommend you to add the lock file into your versioning system. Well, I'm not most places, and I personally prefer to not have lock files in my repo, even though that is what's recommended. The reasoning is because lock files are so huge. You can see here my text editor doesn't even open it using syntax highlighting, because it's 3,000 lines long. So I prefer not to have that in my Git history because it just kind of confuses things. I find lock files in my Git history to be more annoying than having to go through and resolve dependencies. So that's a personal preference, but because of that personal preference, I want to ignore it in my git ignore file, because if you look under git status, it's trying to add this lock file. So I'm going to just add yarn.lock. It looks like I'm not the only one with that preference, because Loopback, when they generated the code, they added this npmrc file, which I like to add to my projects, where you basically set package lock to false, so it won't generate a package-lock JSON file. Yes, package-lock JSON. So I'm just going to ignore this as well. Again, that is just a personal preference. Now, since I added something to my git ignore file, you need to git rn-r-cache dot to basically remove everything from staging, and then I can add everything back, and I can do git status, and it's not adding that file anymore. You will notice all these modified files, and that's because, you know, I changed the prettier settings, and so it went through and formatted the code slightly differently. So that's the reason for that. Okay, now, next I'm going to go through the code and get rid of all these README files. So you see all these README files, I just don't want them. They're basically just telling you, okay, this is what a repository is, this is what a model is. And I already know what they are, so it's not helpful for me. And it might be helpful for you, but I'm going to be going and making videos on what each of these are, so you might not even want it either. I don't really need the developer's guide, because this is not an official Loopback 4 project. And I'm going to get rid of the README file, because I'm going to add it in a different way, which you'll see in a bit. And I'm also going to get rid of the prettier ignore file, because I actually like it when prettier modifies my JSON files. So I'm just going to get rid of that. And if I run, and I don't really mind, well, let's see. Let me start the project. So I think it might go through and prettier the dist code and the node modules code, but yeah, it does, but I don't really mind that it does that. I just don't really feel like I want the prettier ignore file. It's not that useful for me personally. And yeah, that's good enough for me for now. Now let me talk about editor config files. So I always like to add an editor config file to my project. So basically, an editor config file is a text editor agnostic way of defining the rules for mainly spacing and new lines. There's a few other settings like your character set, but for the most part, it's basically just a universal way of, you know, making their text editor behave in a consistent way across the project. So I like to add text editor config files because software developers all have their own personal preferences when it comes to text editors, and I want but I want all the code, you know, being formatted consistently. If it's not, you end up in these crazy situations where, you know, person A is 4 spacing and person B is tabbing and person C is 2 spacing, and you know, the code starts looking messy, and maybe person B's text editor auto formats the code to 4 spaces, and so as they write code, it just changes everything from 2 spaces to 4 spaces and just messes up again the Git history, which really frustrates me because I like to understand who is doing what in the Git history. So that's my reasoning for it. Now I could just add a .editor config file in here and put my settings in here, but I have a Yeoman generator. Yeoman is a generator tool for scaffolding out files. So I built a Yeoman generator for scaffolding out a basic GitHub project. So it will give me my README file, my licensing files, my editor config file, and a few other things like that. So this is what I will use to create the editor config file. If you want to give this a star, that would be great. This is actually built on top of another generator called generator editor conf, which basically generates the editor config file. So if you're not interested in generating the boilerplate GitHub project files that I have, but you want the editor config file, you can use this generator for that. And again, if you want to give this a star, that would be great if you're using this. Cool, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. So to run it, I just run yo, and it'll pop up, show all my generators here. So here we go, GitHub project, and you give it the project name, which it kind of auto-detects, project destination, description. Again, it's kind of auto-detecting a lot of this stuff. The version, you pick a license. I pretty much always go with the MIT license for various reasons. I probably might make an entire video on why open source software developers should use the MIT license, but that's for another day. Author name, again, it's really smart. It's auto-detecting a lot of this stuff. I did not auto-detect my GitHub username or my website correctly. And GitHub repository is correct. Homepage, feature. Now I can kind of add some features here. Let's see. So this is, I guess, to give you a taste of what this identity API will be capable of in the future. It's going to be able to create new users, login users. Yeah, I mean, it's basically just an authentication system. I might add more feature lists here later, but that's good for now. Installation command, basically cloning the project is the installation command, but I'm just not going to put that here for now. Demo URL, I don't have one yet. Dependency, well, this isn't like node module dependencies, more like what software is needed to run this. Pretty much Node.js, https://nodejs.org, and I would say TypeScript. And I'm just going to put the TypeScript website here. So the TypeScript website is typescriptlang.org. Let me just put that there. And that's good enough for dependencies. And then here, this is actually the editor config file generator asking this question. And so it's just asking what languages is this project using. And we're using JavaScript. And there actually is a little bit of HTML and CSS in it, so I'm going to activate that as well. Go ahead, enter. And it's having a conflict with my package.json file. So what I can do is I can look at the diff by typing D. It'll show the difference between the two files. So it's having a conflict because of the license. So it currently in my package.json file there is no license, but it's wanting to put one in. So as long as it's not removing anything else from my package.json file, I'm fine with that change. So I'm going to add that change. So I'm going to say overwrite, and it should have added it in. If we look here under license, yes, MIT. It actually didn't put the author name in here. So my GitHub project generator doesn't really do much with package.json file. It's actually using another generator that generates licenses, and that generator is what tried to manipulate the package.json file. So that's why my generator didn't have the author name. because my GitHub project generator is supposed to be more universal than Node projects, I'm not going to assume that everyone using the GitHub generators building something with a package.json file. But, you know, maybe one of these days I'll make it smarter. But anyways, so I'm going to just put my email here. And I think you can even put your website here. So let's see. There we go. Okay, so let me go ahead and save the file. Okay, there we go. So that generator actually generated a new README file. So if you remember, I deleted the README file. Well, this is why. Because it generates a README file. Really nice README file for you. Listing dependencies, features, etc. I'm just going to leave that there for now. And it also generates, I'll just show you what other things it generated. It generated, of course, a license with, you know, correct information inside of that. And it generates, it generates, actually, yes, it generates a contribution guide for other people wanting to contribute to your project. And it generates a changelog. So, you know, initial release. So this is actually, yeah, I'll leave this as the initial release, even though technically my initial release was earlier, but I actually like to format my markdown that way. But anyways, there we go, okay. And this yo-rc file, this was actually not created from Yeoman. This was actually created when you initially generated your project using the Loopback command line. So I'm actually going to delete this file because it is not needed. Let's look at the editor config file just so you can understand what's going on here. So basically, I'm telling it to use end of line LF, which is the Unix style of line endings. Windows uses a different one, but usually this is what's recommended. Even if you're using a Windows computer, this is pretty much the standardized way of doing line endings in code projects, unless you're just super hardcore .NET, which if you're using Loopback 4, you're probably not. I like to do a 2-space indent size. I like to use spaces over tabs because it just is more consistent when you're working with different text editors. I always like to insert a final new line, and I like to trim trailing white spaces. The neat thing about editor config is it's not language specific. Like, this has nothing to do with what programming language you're using here. Although you can specify language specific settings. But any file that you edit, it's going to apply these rules to it. But you'll see it's not talking about, it doesn't have any settings, unlike Prettier and Linters and stuff, which understand the syntax of your code. Editor config does not understand any of your code syntax. It's more just spacing and indents and tabs and things like that. By the way, root equals true is specified at the top of the file because that is my root editor config file. Because you can have like a hierarchy of editor config files. And actually, I think this is what it means is like the root of your project. Okay, so for HTML, CSS, less files, SAS files, and CSS, I'm using charset UTF-8, and then same with JavaScript files. Right now, I don't have the generator adding TypeScript files, so I'm going to just add TypeScript files. And Markdown, this is the one unique thing about Markdown. I like to disable trimming trailing white space on Markdown, even though it's enabled for everything else. Okay, so let me just show you the editor config file now. So if you see, whenever I start adding new lines of code or indenting in, like it immediately applies 2 spaces, just like I requested, and it trims the bottom of the file. It will have a bunch of white space there. Boom, it trimmed it. So that's why I like that editor config file. And again, it works with pretty much most text editors. If your text editor's not supported immediately out of the box, there should be a plugin to support your text editor. Okay, so with all of those changes done, I'm going to kind of just get a high-level overview of what's been changed. And I'm going to try starting up the app, see if it still works. And let's try this ping endpoint again, like we did in the last video. And boom. Hello from Loopback. You can actually go to the Explorer and try the ping endpoint as well. And again, we get hello from Loopback. So everything seems to be working great. You can find those changes again at the Identity API on GitHub. Again, give it a star if you find this helpful. It's at 0 stars right now, so somebody star the project. If you guys want to see more on Loopback 4, I'm going to be more consistent at publishing videos, so go ahead and subscribe to the channel and give the video a like. Just to give you a heads up of what I'm going to talk about in the next video, because this video was probably a little boring. I didn't really get into much Loopback 4 stuff, but I kind of wanted to get this out of the way. My next video, I'm going to talk about data sources, how to add a data source. And Loopback 4 supports a lot of data sources, Mongo, SQL, etc. You'll see in the next video. So see you then.